What if the pressure you've been feeling lately isn't a sign that something is wrong? What if the exhaustion, confusion, frustration, and constant sense that life isn't moving fast enough are not evidence that you're failing, but evidence that you're changing? Most people experience pressure and assume they need to escape it. Carl Jung believed the opposite. He spent decades studying the moments in life when people felt the most lost, the most uncertain, and the most disconnected from who they thought they were. And he noticed something remarkable. Just before a person undergoes a profound transformation, they often experience an intense period of inner pressure, a feeling that the old version of themselves no longer fits, a feeling that something is ending, even though nothing new has arrived yet. The problem is that most people misinterpret this stage. They look around and see everyone else moving forward while they seem to be standing still. They work harder, push harder, try harder, yet nothing feels like it's changing. So they find themselves trapped between who they were and who they're becoming. But Jung saw it differently. He believed this pressure is not the breakdown of your life. It's the emergence of your next level. And according to Jung, there are 6 psychological stages that almost always appear before this transformation takes place. If you've been feeling stuck, restless, exhausted, or strangely disconnected from the person you used to be, you may already be moving through them right now. This video is a map of those 6 stages. And by the end, you may realize that what you've been calling pressure was actually the beginning of your transformation all along. 1. When you are tired of your own self, you can sleep 8 hours and wake up tired from it. You can take the vacation, finish the project, clear the inbox, and still feel the weight of something that rest does not touch. It sits in the body like a stone that has been there so long you stopped noticing it was heavy, until one day you notice nothing else. Most people mistake this for burnout. They adjust the workload, they try the morning routine again with slightly different ingredients, and nothing changes, not because the approach is wrong, but because they are treating the wrong condition entirely. What you are feeling is not exhaustion from doing too much. It is exhaustion from being someone who is no longer you. Carl Jung gave this a name with surgical precision. He called it the persona. Not a metaphor, not a loosely defined concept, but a specific psychological structure he observed forming in every person from the earliest years of life. The word comes from the Latin for the mask worn by actors in ancient theater, and Jung chose it deliberately. The mask was never meant to be permanent. He wrote, "The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself, as well as others, think one is." Read that slowly. What you think you are, what others think you are. And beneath both of those, a third thing, what you actually are, the one that has been waiting with extraordinary patience for the performance to end. The persona begins as survival. The child learns sometimes through praise, sometimes through the quiet withdrawal of love at the wrong moment, that certain versions of themselves are welcome and certain versions are not. So the child does what intelligent creatures do under pressure. It adapts. It learns which parts to show and which parts to keep in the dark. And over time, it becomes so skilled at the performance that it forgets the performance is what it is. By the time you are an adult, the persona is not something you put on in the morning. It is the shape your entire life has been organized around. Your career choices carry it. Your relationships reflect it. The way you speak in certain rooms and go quiet in others. The way you help before you are asked and ask for nothing yourself. The way you became the reliable one, the capable one, the one who holds it together. All of it is the persona functioning at full capacity, and it costs something enormous to maintain. Jung was specific about this. Every day you spend being who others expect you to be instead of who you actually are is a day the deeper self is denied its energy. The life force that should be moving toward your actual becoming is being redirected entirely into keeping the performance convincing. That is the stone in your body. That is the sleep that does not rest you. That is the exhaustion a vacation cannot touch, because it is not fatigue from what you are doing. It is fatigue from what you are pretending. Marcus, 41 years old, 15 years into a career that by every external measure was working. He was the person people called when something needed to be handled. He had built his entire identity around being that person, so completely and for so long that he had entirely stopped noticing there was anything beneath it. One Monday morning, he drove to the office, sat in the parking garage, and could not open the car door. Not anxiety, not a panic attack. Something quieter and somehow more frightening. Just the absolute absence of a reason to open it. He sat there for 40 minutes. Then he called his therapist. The first thing he said in that session was, "I have done everything right. Why do I feel like I don't exist?" His therapist said, "Because the person who did everything right is not you. That is the role you have been playing. And a role cannot feel like it exists no matter how well it is performed, because it was never alive to begin with." When the persona begins to crack, most people panic and try to repair it. They find a new goal to organize themselves around, a new version of the performance with updated costumes. And for a while it works, until the exhaustion returns heavier than before, because now you are maintaining the original mask and the repair job on top of it. But something is underneath that crack. Not collapse, not the absence of who you were. Something older than the role. Something that was there before the world got its hands on you and started teaching you which parts of yourself were acceptable. The question is not how to stop being exhausted by the mask. The question is who has been waiting behind it. 2. The part of you that you fear most is your most powerful part. You already know about the shadow, the parts we hide because they are shameful, the anger we deny, the jealousy we pretend is something else, the darkness we keep in the basement of our personality. That shadow most people have heard of. But Jung wrote something that almost nobody quotes. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Not the more evil it is. The blacker and denser it is. The heavier the accumulation. The greater the pressure. The more total the eventual eruption when containment finally fails. Now, here is where it becomes something most people are completely unprepared for. The golden shadow is not the dark material you have been suppressing. It is the light. It is the talent you were told was arrogance to claim. The ambition you learned to call selfishness. The vision so large and so specific that somewhere along the way you decided it was safer to keep it hidden than to let it exist in a world that might say, "Not for you." The version of yourself you have only allowed yourself to glimpse in private, in the moments before sleep, in the fragments of dreams you do not let yourself remember fully in the daylight. You did not bury that part of yourself because you were lazy. You buried it because you were intelligent. You learned through experiences that left marks, whether or not they left visible scars, that being fully yourself had a social cost. That shining at the level you were actually capable of meant no longer fitting into the spaces where you had been told you belonged. So you did what every intelligent organism does. under that kind of pressure. You made yourself smaller, and you called it humility. Marcus Aurelius, writing to himself in his private journals 2,000 years ago, put it plainly: waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be one. Jung and Aurelius, separated by centuries, arrived at the same place. The retreat from your own potential is never about capacity. It is never about talent. It is always, without exception, about the fear that the person you actually are will not be welcome in the spaces where you have worked so hard to belong. And here is what that suppression actually does, because this is what most people miss entirely. When light is contained, it does not disappear. It accumulates. It builds pressure the same way any energy does when it is forced into a space too small to hold it. Every year you choose the safety of smallness over the discomfort of your actual scale, the golden shadow grows denser, and the pressure behind it grows more absolute. This is why the silent period you are in right now does not feel empty. It does not feel like nothing. It feels like pressure, like something enormous trying to move through a space slightly too narrow for it, like the specific, unnameable tension of a life organized around a version of yourself that your actual self has long since outgrown. That is not stagnation. That is accumulation. Ask yourself one honest question, right now, with nobody watching. What would happen if you were as capable as you have always secretly suspected you might be? If the first thing that appeared was not excitement, but a quiet, specific fear, you have just located your golden shadow. You have just found the place where the light went to wait when the world told you the light was too much. It has not gone anywhere. It has been building pressure since the day you decided it was safer to keep it contained. And the silence you are living through, the one that feels like standing still while the world moves around you, may not be emptiness at all. It may be the exact accumulation that has to happen before what has been contained can no longer remain contained. The pressure has a name. It has a threshold. And when it reaches that threshold, what happens next is something not even Jung had a word for until he borrowed one from a philosopher dead for 2,000 years. 3. The turn no one saw coming and no one can stop. Here is something nobody tells you about real change. It comes when the resistance costs more than the change. And that moment, the precise psychological instant when the cost of staying who you have been exceeds the cost of becoming who you are, does not belong to you. You cannot schedule it. You cannot summon it through discipline or delay it through fear. It arrives on its own terms, governed by a law older than psychology and more precise than any strategy the ego has ever designed. Jung borrowed the name for this law from Heraclitus, a Greek philosopher who observed something in the structure of the natural world 25 centuries ago that the entirety of human civilization has not improved upon. Everything contains its opposite. And when any force is pushed to its absolute extreme, it does not stop. It does not fade. It reverses completely. With the full accumulated energy of everything that pressed it toward that extreme, now moving in the opposite direction at once. Jung called this the enantiodromia. He wrote in Psychological Types, an enantiodromia, sooner or later, everything becomes its opposite. He applied this law to the human soul across decades of clinical observation and found something extraordinary. The lives most likely to undergo the most sudden and total reversals, from invisible to undeniable, from silent to unstoppable, were not the lives that tried the hardest or were the most disciplined or the most deserving by any conventional measure. They were the lives held at the extreme the longest. The bow drawn furthest back, the spring at maximum tension, the charge built to the absolute threshold before the current inverts. The law is not poetic, it is structural, and it applies to you with the same precision it applies to every natural system that has ever operated by it. Now here's what Jung said about this threshold that almost everyone misses. The enantiodromia point is not the beginning of the rise. It is the end of the resistance. And these are not the same thing. The rise was already in motion long before the resistance ended. It was in motion during every season of silence. Every night you sat in the compression when the old life was right there, entirely accessible, waiting to be rebuilt and called good enough. The reversal was building during all of that. You simply could not see it from the surface. Think about an archer and a bow. The arrow does not move because the archer is strong enough. It moves because continuing to hold the string becomes structurally impossible. There is a point, not a decision point, but a physics point, where releasing is the only remaining option. Not because someone chose it, because the system has no other direction left to move. You are that archer. Every year in the compression, every silent season that added another layer to what was building underground was another inch the string was drawn back. And here is what the threshold actually feels like from the inside. Because Jung was specific about this, and the specificity matters. It does not feel like readiness. The ego never feels ready for the reversals the self has prepared. The ego is too committed to the familiar shape of the managed life to welcome what is coming to replace it. What you feel instead is something more honest, a very particular exhaustion, not from doing too much, but from continuing to be someone your internal reality has already moved past. A growing impossibility of spending energy on things the deepest part of you has already finished with. The specific tiredness of a person maintaining a structure that no longer fits what is living inside it. That is not collapse. That is the string at its furthest point. And what happens at that point, according to a law that has never failed under any conditions, is not a question of if, only when. So, if you are sitting in that exhaustion right now, if you recognize the feeling of maintaining something that has become heavier than it has any right to be, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not behind the people who look like they are moving. You are not failing by a timeline that was never yours to begin with. You are the bow at full tension in the last compression before the release that was always coming. The arrow is ready. It has been ready for longer than you know. 4. The years nobody saw were the years that built everything. There is a season of life that has no name in the language most of us were given. We have language for failure. Entire industries exist to help people process the setback, the loss, the visible collapse that at least has the dignity of a story you can tell and be understood. We have language for success, the milestones, the evidence that a life is moving in the direction the world recognizes and rewards. But there is a third season, neither failure nor success. A season where you are doing everything you know how to do, bringing everything you have, and producing no visible evidence that any of it is working. A season where your energy has gone somewhere you cannot follow it, and the gap between who you know yourself to be and what your life currently reflects has become so wide it feels like a separate kind of suffering entirely. Jung had a name for this. He called it the night sea journey. He borrowed it from the oldest mythologies in human history. The hero swallowed by the whale, the sun descending below the horizon into the underworld, traveling through total darkness, invisible to the world above, before rising on the other side with a light that would not have been possible without the descent. Jung looked at these myths and understood something most modern people dismiss entirely. They were not invented stories. They were maps. Maps of a psychological process so universal, so precisely recurring across every culture and every century of human experience, that the unconscious had encoded it into mythology so that the people living through it would have a language for what was happening to them. He wrote, "The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek." Not as inspiration, as orientation. The thing that feels most like danger in this season, the silence, the invisibility, the formless dissolution that has no story to tell, that is not the obstacle between you and what you are becoming. It is the path. The depth of the descent is not a measure of how far behind you have fallen. It is a measure of how high you are being prepared to go. In ancient Greek mythology, Persephone was pulled into the underworld against her will, and when she returned, she carried something none of the gods who had remained in the light possessed. She could move between worlds. She had authority in both the living and the dead, because she had been to the place none of the others had survived. Jung read this, not as mythology, but as psychological truth. The ones who have known the darkness of their own interior do not simply recover from it. They come back with access to a depth of understanding that no shortcut, no carefully managed life can produce. Those years underground were not years taken from Persephone. They were the exact source of everything that made her formidable. Modern neuroscience arrived at the same place through a different door. When the brain is reorganizing itself around a genuinely new way of being, it must first dissolve the old neural connections before it can build new ones. The period between dissolution and reconstruction, when the old is gone and the new is not yet visible, is not inactivity. It is the period of most intense internal work. The surface shows nothing. Underneath, everything is being rebuilt. You are not behind. You are in the reconstruction phase. In a small circle one evening, a woman shared something she had been carrying for 4 years. She described it as a fog she could not explain to anyone, a long stretch when she felt neither broken nor whole, neither moving nor stopped, just suspended somewhere between the version of herself she had left behind and one she could not yet see. "I spent 4 years thinking I was wasting the best years of my life," she said. "Then I looked back, and those 4 years were the only years I ever learned to stay with myself. Everything I have now has roots there. Everything." The years she had mourned as lost were the exact foundation of everything that came after them. What the night sea journey builds is not visible during the building. It was never meant to be. The roots do not grow where the light is. They grow in the dark, in the silence, in the specific pressure of a season the surface cannot detect, and the world outside has no instruments to measure. The depth to which those roots have grown is the only thing that determines how high what rises above them can go. And if you are in that season right now, if you are living in the invisible third space that has no name in the language you were given, I want you to know something. What looks like standing still from the outside is the heaviest lifting of your entire life. And it is building something that no one who watched the surface during this time will be able to account for when it finally appears. Chapter 5. When the war inside you finally ends. In 1916, Carl Jung wrote a paper so ahead of its time it was not published for decades. He wrote it not for an audience, but for himself, to articulate something he had been watching happen in his patients that no existing framework in psychology could explain. He called it the transcendent function. He wrote, "The confrontation of the two positions generates a tension charged with energy and creates a living third thing, not a logical stillbirth in accordance with the principle tertium non datur, but a movement out of the suspension between opposites. Let that land before moving forward, not a compromise between two opposing forces, not choosing one side over the other and calling it growth. A living third thing, something that did not exist before the tension between the two created the precise conditions necessary for it to emerge. Something that could not have been decided into existence. Something that could only be born from the sustained pressure of two equally real forces refusing to cancel each other out. This is one of the most radical ideas Jung ever produced, and it almost never appears in the places where his name is mentioned, because it does not fit the way we have been taught to think about change and becoming. We were handed a binary operating system, this or that, stay or go, be this person or be that person. Choose the safe path or abandon it for the one that keeps calling to you from somewhere you cannot quite locate. And we exhaust ourselves cycling between the options, not because we are indecisive, not because we are weak or confused or not trying hard enough, but because both sides are genuinely real, and neither one alone is the complete answer. The transcendent function is the psyche's own capacity to resolve what the ego cannot resolve by force, not by eliminating one side of the tension, but by holding both sides long enough, staying in the suspension between them without collapsing into either, until something that contains both but cannot be reduced to either rises from the space between them. That third thing cannot be thought into existence. It cannot be decided or strategized or willed into clarity. It emerges. It rises. It appears when you have stopped trying to force the resolution as something that was always there, waiting for the noise of the internal war to quiet enough for you to see it. Now stop for just a moment. Think about where you are right now. Not in your life in general. Right now, in this specific season, is there a tension in you between two things that both feel real? A version of yourself that knows exactly what needs to change, and a version that cannot let go of what currently exists. A part that is ready for something, and a part that is terrified of what that readiness will cost. If you feel that, if there is something in you that recognized itself in that question before your mind had time to analyze it, write it in the comments. Not the full story. Just one word or one short sentence that describes the tension you are living in right now. You will be surprised how many people are sitting in the exact same suspension, believing they are alone in it, when in reality it is one of the most universal experiences in the entire landscape of human becoming. Because what looks like being stuck is almost never actually being stuck. Jung called it the necessary suspension, the exact condition under which the transcendent function does its deepest work. The war you are trying to end by choosing a side is not a war that ends by choosing a side. It ends when both sides have been held long enough, honored long enough, taken seriously enough, that the third thing they were always pointing toward finally has enough space to become visible. And here is what makes this so important to understand in the context of everything we have already covered today. The night sea journey built the foundation. The enantiodromia reached its threshold. The golden shadow accumulated its pressure. The persona cracked open to reveal what was underneath. All of that was preparation for this exact moment, the moment when the two halves of who you are stop fighting and start synthesizing. Two rivers running toward each other from opposite directions cannot be forced to meet. But if both keep moving, if neither abandons its course in favor of the other, the place where they join finds itself. And at that confluence, something is created that is more powerful than either river was alone. Not because someone decided it would be, because the movement of both, sustained long enough, made it inevitable. Jung observed across decades of clinical work that the patients who moved through this suspension most completely were never the ones who forced the resolution fastest. They were the ones who learned to remain present in the uncertainty long enough for what was being assembled to finish assembling. The ego wants a verdict. The self is building something the ego does not yet have the capacity to recognize. The war inside you is not preventing your emergence. It is preparing it. And the fact that you are still here, still watching, still willing to sit with the tension rather than run from it, that is not nothing. That is the exact quality that the transcendent function requires to do what it does. You are closer to the third thing than you know. Then 6. When the world starts moving toward you, a conversation that turned in an unexpected direction and left you holding something you kept thinking about for weeks, long after the person who said it had forgotten saying it. A book that appeared at the exact moment you needed the question it contained. Someone who mentioned something offhand, without knowing they were handing you anything, that unlocked a door you had been standing in front of for months without recognizing it as a door. A dream that stayed past the morning, carrying a clarity the waking mind could not fully account for and could not dismiss. You called these things coincidence. The word felt accurate in a way that was also slightly insufficient. As though it named the event without explaining the weight of it. Jung spent the better part of his intellectual life insisting, against the fierce resistance of a world committed to the comfort of materialism, that they were never coincidences. He called them synchronicities, and he devoted years of collaboration with the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Wolfgang Pauli to articulating precisely why. Their conclusion was one of the most radical propositions in the history of human thought. The inner world of the psyche and the outer world of physical events are not two separate systems that occasionally brush against each other. They are two expressions of a single underlying reality. Jung called it the unus mundus, the one world, the unified field from which both interior experience and exterior event draw their existence. He wrote, "Synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see." Not a mystical claim, a clinical observation made across decades of recorded cases. The eyes that see synchronicity are not special eyes. They belong to a psyche coherent enough to receive what was always being sent. In his records, Jung documented a case that has remained in every serious account of his work. A patient described a dream in which a golden scarab beetle appeared, a symbol of transformation in Egyptian mythology. As she recounted it in session, a real beetle, a rose chafer, as close to a golden scarab as Central Europe produces, flew in through the window of Jung's office. Jung caught it and handed it to her. "Here is your scarab." The rational armor she had maintained through months of therapy dissolved in that moment. Not because a bug flew through a window, but because the boundary between her inner world and the outer one had, for one verifiable instant, ceased to exist. The psyche met reality at the exact moment it was ready to be met. Jung did not call this magic. He called it what it was: evidence. Now here is what most people miss about synchronicity, the part that changes everything about how you understand what is happening in your life right now. Synchronicity does not accelerate randomly. It does not appear as a reward for suffering enough or waiting long enough. It accelerates at a very specific and recognizable point in the process of becoming yourself, at the point where the inner fragmentation has been sufficiently resolved that you are no longer at war with your own interior. Think of it this way: when you are still in the persona fatigue, still in the accumulation of the golden shadow, still in the pressure before the enantiodromia, still in the night sea journey, still in the suspension of the internal war, you are generating something that functions like interference. Not a single clear frequency, but a dozen conflicting ones, all broadcasting simultaneously, and nothing coherent enough to receive what is being sent in return. But as each of those stages progresses, something shifts at the signal level. The interference decreases. One frequency, clear and sustained, begins to move outward, and the world, which was always capable of responding, finally has something specific to respond to. The opportunities were always there. The right conversations were always possible. The doors were always in the walls. What changed is not the world. What changed is you. You became coherent enough that the world could find you. Pay attention to what is already beginning to arrive, not the large things, the small ones first. The conversation that turns, the book that appears, the stranger who mentions something they have no reason to mention, that lands in you with a weight entirely disproportionate to the casualness with which it was offered. Do not dismiss those as wishful thinking. The unus mundus is not warming up. It is not preparing to cooperate with you at some future point when you have earned it sufficiently. It is cooperating right now in the only way it can, by sending you exactly what the interior shift you have been through has made you capable of receiving. If you are honest with yourself, you already know. The arrivals have begun. They are small, still, quiet, easy to explain away. But they are not random. Nothing in the realm of the psyche ever is. The world will call this a comeback. It will reach for the only story it knows for the kind of transformation it is about to witness. The fall, the struggle, the return to a previous high point now slightly elevated. It will apply that story to you with complete confidence. It will be wrong. You are not returning to anything. The version of you that existed before the persona began to crack, before the golden shadow started accumulating its pressure, before the night sea journey began building what the surface could never measure. That version of you is not the destination. It is not the starting point either. It is the raw material that every single stage required in order to produce what is standing in its place now. You are arriving at a level that could only be reached by the exact path you have been walking. Not the efficient path. Not the path that looked impressive from the outside. The specific, unglamorous, invisible path of someone who went all the way into the silence and did not rebuild the old life just to escape the discomfort of not yet knowing what the new one would be. That is not a backstory. That is the entire reason this level was ever possible. Jung said something in the final years of his life that almost nobody takes as the practical instruction it actually is. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. That choice is not made once. It is made in every moment you refuse to return to the smallness the first half of life required of you. In the dark, without applause, without confirmation, with only the quiet certainty of someone who has stopped waiting for permission. If this video names something you have been living but did not yet have words for, leave one sentence in the comments. Not your title, not your achievements, just where you actually are right now. One honest sentence. You will find you are far less alone in that place than the silence made it feel.